passionate, driven, enthusiastic, euphoric. This is who we are as entrepreneurs. But how we leverage these incredible attributes to dream and build businesses that scale and grow is what this podcast is all about. Hello, I'm attorneypreneur Josh Brown, and welcome to Franchise Euphoria. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Franchise Euphoria. Josh Brown here. Thrilled to be back. Wanted to talk today about something that I read recently by a friend of mine and cohort named Jeff Lefler. He's from Canada. He's a guy who started and runs a company called FranchiseGrade.com. And I met him about a year or so ago when he reached out to me to do some blogging for his FranchiseGrade.com blog and company. And what Franchise Grade does is they grade franchises, hence the name. And he's kind of put together some interesting statistics through his data and through the data that he's amassed over time, where he utilizes statistical data to rate franchise systems against one another, and in particular to rate different aspects of the franchise disclosure documents to really help people see whether or not one franchise is maybe better than another when it comes to certain aspects of the franchise disclosure documents and some of the material aspects of what's involved in running a franchise. Well, Jeff wrote an interesting article for Blue Mau Mau, which is a franchise owner's news source online, and he titled it, "Does the Franchise Industry Need Reform?" Well, of course, that captured my attention, so I read on, and he, throughout the article, provides some really interesting numbers that relate to franchising as a whole that kind of took me back a little bit, and I think will be a little bit surprising to you. First and foremost, he talks about that according to his statistics, or his business's statistics that they've gathered, over $182 billion has been invested into new franchise outlets in the last 5 years. I mean, that is a staggering number, $182 billion just in the last 5 years. And that's for people, for franchisees, for owner operators, for the people like you and me who go out there and spend and invest their hard-earned money into franchise business. $182 billion. When you look at net growth for the top 500 franchise systems, the top 500 accounted for a net growth of plus 68,044 franchise outlets, while the bottom 500 franchise systems accounted for a closure rate of negative 48,433 outlets. If you look at outlet sales, according to the Franchise Grade statistics, based on net growth, the top 500 franchise systems opened 107,876 outlets, where based on the same net growth, the bottom 500 franchise systems only opened 40,181 outlets. This next statistic that he speaks of really kind of took me back, and that is the size of franchise systems. He did a measurement of the average number of outlets per franchise system. And what he found was that 68% of all franchise systems have less than 50 franchised outlets. 68% of all franchise systems have less than 50 franchised outlets, while only about 3% have more than 1,000 franchise outlets. So think about that. Only about 3% of franchise systems have more than 1,000 units. That is a really, really small percentage. And 68% have less than 50 franchise outlets. Well, that really struck me for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that when I work with individuals and help them decipher between franchise systems and help them look at the legal documents and help review the franchise disclosure documents, one of the things we obviously take a look at, and I encourage the potential buyers to look into, is the number of units that the franchise has. And in speaking to a lot of the current and former franchisees, and while 50 franchise units may sound like a lot of business units. It's really not for a franchise. And that's a striking number to me because it says that the majority of franchise systems are really kind of small. And I think that there's a misnomer out there, at least in the people I talk to, that one of the main reasons they look to investing in a franchise system is because they have a belief that the system has the answers or has the business answers to help ensure that they will be successful, more so than if they went out and did it on their own. Well, if you've got a franchise business and you only have about 50 franchise units, you're relatively small in the grand scheme of, or in the gamut of what franchising is. And a lot of systems that have 50 or less franchises really are still working out the basic tweaks of their system. And if you're a potential investor in one of those systems, you really need to ask yourself, is that something you want to invest in at that time? Do you want to invest your hard-earned money into an upfront franchise fee, a build-out, and a continuing royalty so that you can essentially pay for the franchisor to continue to fine-tune their system? Look, the reality is all franchise systems are constantly improving, but there's a baseline that you need to be looking out for where you are sure that there has been a proven track record and that franchisees in circumstances similar to yours have actually been successful. If you haven't seen that, or if the system hasn't been around long enough to show that, or if they don't have enough units around to provide that to you, then you just have to understand going into that system that that's an added risk. Because again, one of the biggest pieces to franchising is that you're buying what you hope to be as a proven model. And if it hasn't been proven in your geographic area or in a geographic area similar to yours that you can compare, then obviously it's a more risky endeavor. One of the other striking statistics that I read from Jeff's article was that he indicates that although it's difficult to provide exact numbers, Franchise Grade estimates that over 50% of franchisees do not make it to their renewal date. So what does that mean? Well, in franchising, you are signing a long-term contract, often 10, 15, or 20 years. Certainly there's franchises that are 5 years and 7 years, but at a bare minimum, you're signing a contract that's 5 years, and sometimes you're asked to sign a contract that's 20 years. And so your renewal date is obviously at the end of that original period that you're signing for. And based on their estimates, over 50% do not make it to the renewal date. So in other words, over 50% fail before they get to their renewal date. That number is remarkably lower than a lot of the numbers you see out there with regard to franchising. I hear a lot of people hang on to numbers like, 90% of franchises are successful, very few of them fail. I think that number has been proven to be inaccurate. Notwithstanding that, people still rely on that because they see it online and they believe it to be the gospel when it's not. But I think that's striking that Jeff, through franchisegrade.com and through his statistical data and through his team's statistical data, have really come up with a number that's far lower than that. And I think conservatively estimating that 50% of franchisees do not make it to the renewal date. Again, these are hard numbers, and these are things you really, really need to pay attention to if you're out there considering a franchise system. This really isn't any joke. I think people approach franchising in a very cavalier fashion. They want to believe in the system. They want to believe what they're being told. And in coming to it from that perspective, a lot of times they skip over the necessary steps to make sure that what they're buying into is actually a good system. So Jeff wrote this article in the context of, does franchise industry need reform? And I think his conclusion is that yes, it absolutely does. But at the end of the day, reforms can only do so much. I think, from his perspective, and I would agree with this, the most basic reform for every franchisee is to do proper and comprehensive due diligence. In other words, take your time to research a system, take your time to research multiple systems. And if you get it down to a few franchisees that you're really now looking at the particulars, I will say this, franchisegrade.com, I think, can be a good resource for you in terms of comparing aspects from the various franchise disclosure documents that you have. Because what you have to remember is the franchise disclosure documents are really your insight into the franchise system. That, combined with what you learned through a discovery day, with what you learned through training, with what you learned through talking with other franchisees, both current and former franchisees, with what you learn in talking with your professionals who help you through this process, accountants and whatnot, who can run the numbers, who can give you an idea of when you can expect to be profitable. All these things play in to your due diligence process as you're looking at a franchise. So I would just encourage you to, again, slow down, take your time. If you're listening to this and you're at that point in the process where you're having to make a decision and possibly you're feeling the pressure of a franchisor pushing on you to make a decision quickly, take a step back. Understand that if it's a good opportunity, it's going to be there a month from now, even if it feels like you have to make a decision right now. Don't let the outside pressures or forces from franchisors skew the way in which you research the business. These numbers from Franchise Grade, I think, do tell an interesting story, and I think it's somewhat of a warning to potential franchisees coming into new systems to really understand about franchising things that they don't, to really have a good understanding of not just the franchise system they're buying, but just franchising overall, so that fundamentally, when you're asking yourself, do you want to buy a system, you're comparing that with whether or not you could just start it yourself. And so that's ultimately a fundamental question that I like all of the people I work with to ask themselves, to make sure that they're crystal clear on why they're going with a franchise versus just doing it on their own. And for many, going the franchise route makes perfect sense. But for a lot of people as well, doing it themselves ends up being a very, very a way in which they can realize their own dreams and not put themselves into a situation that they are going to later regret. So hopefully this episode was helpful to you. I know I got deep into some numbers here, which hopefully wasn't too confusing. But if you want to check out Jeff's article, you can just go to www.bluemau.org. That's BLUEMAU.org. And just look up Jeff Lefler and you can pull up his article, Does the Franchise Industry Need Reform? There's also a lot of good articles on that website. I know the editor a little bit from that side. I know he's been at it for quite some time. So I think that'll give you some good educational information as well with regard to franchising. Look forward to talking with you next week. And until next time, happy franchising.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.